So said the Duke of Wellington, the man who finally defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. War is a horrible business. And yet, in the midst of carnage and destruction, we can see heroism, endurance, and willpower that goes beyond. They lived by the sword and they died by the sword. They followed the warrior's way. The Vikings were ferocious seagoing warriors, pirates, and traders who raided and settled across a broad swath of the globe from the 8th until the 11th century. The original Vikings hailed from Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. They were skilled navigators and traders and knew the coasts of Europe like the veins of an arm. When we think of Vikings, we think of Viking raiding parties. And when it comes to Viking raids, it was the attack on Lindisfarne Monastery off the coast of Northumberland in 793 AD that sealed the Vikings' brutal reputation.
Lindisfarne is the first successful Viking activity. We do know from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is an account the monks keep in various places in England in the pre-modern world.
Lindisfarne was an important and wealthy monastery. From a Viking perspective, it was surely plunder with low risk and the possibility of a rich raid.
Suddenly they run in a whole bunch of men who have no rationale to fighting, no weapons to fight with, and tons and tons and tons of really pretty stuff. Things that the Vikings know that they can sell elsewhere, including even the gold that the pages are made of in these Bibles and other books that the Lindisfarne monks have. It'd be like finding a treasure chest that was completely unguarded. After the Lindisfarne Abbey raid, the Viking attacks increased phenomenally into the North Sea, across to England, over to Ireland, over to France and Germany.
Alcuin, a Northumbrian scholar serving in Charlemagne's court in Aachen, wrote of Lindisfarne, "The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the street. Never before has such an atrocity been seen." The raid sent shockwaves through Anglo-Saxon England and the Christian West, with good reason. The raid on the monastery was just the beginning. Viking raids would terrorize England for the next 200 years.
The Vikings were known all over Europe for their long ships, by means of which they could just pop in the right moment and at the right place, crossing seas and rivers.
They were odd individuals no matter what, the ones who decided, geez, farming isn't for me. So let's go on and see what else I can do that might be profitable.
They were surely very fierce and savage. Although, in the last decades, there has been a debate among scholars, because some of them suggested that as we rely on sources that were written by the people who actually were attacked by Vikings, maybe the sources are, in a way, exaggerating the ferocity of the Vikings.
From one point of view, we can say that the alleged savagery of the attacks of the Viking can also be referred to the type of information, the type of historical information and chronicles that we have, which all come from the hands of the monks, of the Christian culture, the Christian world. So they used to depict the Vikings in a specific way, in a terrible way, we can say. But on the other hand, we can also say that these Vikings were as brutal and savage as all the other warriors in the medieval era.
The Viking chieftains would decide on a target and plan their raid in advance. They would strike under cover of darkness with lightning speed and a savagery unprecedented even for medieval times. Growing up in a small village close to the Danish Sea, young Viking Sigurd Bjornsson gains his sea legs while still young. From his elders, he learns how important Viking longboats were in their lightning raids. Arriving seemingly out of nowhere in the fastest ships of the day, they would storm ashore ready to attack. When required, they could also row their ships upriver and tie them off.
The Vikings did not like attacking large groups of people. They were never very many themselves. Maybe a ship full, maybe two ships. Perhaps at times they could get even more. But usually it's just one ship and it's raiding an area.
The Vikings developed navigation skills that were pretty much advanced. We can see these when we analyze the several battles that they managed to win on the sea, although they also managed to lose many of them. We can also see these at the center of their expeditions, of their journeys through the seas and through the ocean. So Eric the Red, for example, is famous for having traversed the ocean, reaching the American continent and what is nowadays Canada.
Sigurd watches many times as his father returns home from raids laden with booty. It fills him with desire to go raiding himself. But why did the Vikings come screaming out of their Scandinavian homelands in the late 8th century AD? This is still a hotly disputed question. The young Viking Sigurd Bjornsson is a second son, destined to be a warrior, a born fighter. Sigurd's journey begins in 10th century Denmark, around a century after the looting of Lindisfarne Monastery, the height of the Vikings' marauding and raping of Europe. He has quite a reputation to live up to, if he wishes to be considered a Viking in the warrior's way. But why did the Vikings begin to venture beyond their borders into neighboring and, in some cases, faraway countries? Historians point to a rising population, more mouths to feed, combined with poor harvests. At the same time, the Vikings' skill as shipbuilders and as navigators had grown in leaps and bounds. All reasonable explanations. However, it's just as likely that it was simple opportunism, that some of the more adventurous warriors raided their neighbors, and when they returned home laden with booty, the idea began to catch on. Although there was a lot more to Vikings than their raids on villages, monasteries, and convents. It was for these assaults using shock tactics that we will always remember them. These were warriors who were taught to fight from boyhood. Sigurd Bjornsson was no exception to this rule. These may look like children's games, but it wasn't long before wooden swords would be replaced with real ones.
Probably they started to learn how to fight quite early when they were very young. For example, we know that leaders like Knut the Great took part in campaigns when they were not even 20 years old. Or another war leader like Harald Hardrada was wounded in a battle when he was just 15.
Young warriors like Sigurd Bjornsson were not only expected to become marksmen, they were supposed to be able to throw their javelins high over the ranks of their enemies. Every young Viking lad would need to master archery. The bow and arrow was used for hunting, and archery tournaments were common. The Viking sagas have many archery contests.
Discover the past with exclusive medieval documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything from our series on medieval pleasures to the notorious Knights Templar, the Princes in the Tower, and the Battle of Hastings. Immerse yourself in the captivating stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
The full range of Viking weapons consisted of javelins, bow and arrows, axes, as well as seeks and swords, the preferred weapons of the nobility. For Vikings, as much if not more than medieval knights, swords in particular had an almost mythical dimension.
Viking swords are beautiful. Each one is a work of art. You can see the beauty and the simplicity of their proportions and decor. They're an invaluable legacy left to us by our Viking ancestors, depicting a rich history of art and the behavior of mankind.
We have to imagine our Viking warrior with a shield, defending himself with a shield that was made of parallel wooden boards. It could have been colored in bright colors even, with an iron boss in the middle.
A weapon used by both walking warriors and cavalry fighters was the lance. It was relatively cheap and easy to manufacture. As a result, they were produced in great numbers, making it a very popular weapon. Scholars believe almost every fighter carried one. Ancient authors say the lance was a typical weapon of every Germanic warrior. The lance, also referred to as the spear, was so important it was spoken of in runic writings. Some spears were embedded with magical inscriptions. Another important weapon was the seax, though it wasn't a compulsory piece of equipment. Think of the seax as a big knife. Its length could vary depending on who made it. It was different from an ordinary knife in that it was designed to be a massive cutting weapon. It had to have some weight in order to withstand being struck without the blade being damaged.
And then they would use axes that we tend to consider the Viking weapon par excellence. But actually, when we found axes in the graves, to make a distinction between a tool and a weapon, so we don't know much about their use.
The most complicated and expensive weapon to produce was the sword, as only members of the upper social group could obtain one. It was not part of a warrior's standard equipment. We don't know if swords were made exclusively in Scandinavia or if they were imported. They were probably made in more than one place, but we believe the blades were almost certainly imported into Scandinavia. During the Viking era, the mere possession of a sword meant that the owner was significant and not just an ordinary fighter.
The sword could be actually decorated, as well as the scabbard, where the sword was kept. Some of the swords in the Icelandic sagas even have names. This suggests that they were considered really important by Viking warriors.
So we know the Vikings had an impressive array of assault weapons, but what about defense? Not all warriors could afford a helmet or armor, but they all carried a shield into battle. Many Viking warrior remains have wounds to the head and legs, where the shield could not protect them. Shields could also be used as makeshift stretchers to carry wounded, and shields could even be used as weapons, something that Sigurd particularly appreciates.
Vikings wore armor. They wore mail armor, so rings, sometimes we call them redundantly chainmail. They are mail. But they were protective, extremely protective to the body and to the torso. Mind the Vikings did not like having their arms bound at all by the armor, and so often their arms were free from armor. They would wear furs and they would wear leathers and other things that would protect them there. But the chief protection for all the Vikings were two. One, their helmet, and second, their shield. And that, if you think about it, could cover everything pretty much from the top of their head down to their knees. And that's the most important part of any warrior's body that needs to be protected. If you've got a wound in the arm or a wound in the leg, you can pretty well survive it. But if you've got a wound to the torso, especially if it affects the organs, or if you have a wound at all to the head, you're not going to make it. So the shield was particularly made, now it was usually just wood, but it was made with lots of metal bits, and it was really thick, and it was pretty heavy. And the Vikings would use this in conjunction with others. If they did need to fight together with another person, in conjunction with others, where they could overlap those shields and actually make a field fortification, what we call a shield wall, and that would protect them on a battlefield about as well as anything.
In battle, the first line of attack and defense was the shield formation. In a shield wall, a Viking's left arm would always carry his shield, and right arm his weapon. Otherwise, the shields would not have been able to overlap. Of course, the image of the Viking handed down over the last century or two also includes Vikings wearing those famous horned helmets.
Actually, the idea that the Viking warriors were wearing horned helmets comes from the 19th century. It's a romanticized way of looking back to these savage warriors, and you find some description pointing to this direction also in some of Wagner's operas. We can say that it would be really unpractical for a soldier, for a warrior, to wear a horned helmet, because this would expose the warrior himself to all the various items and weapons and objects that would be thrown against him.
Viking warfare was a lot less romantic than a Wagnerian opera. But the Vikings, too, loved a good story, especially if accompanied by strong drink. Typical for Viking lads, Sigurd Bjornsson would have started drinking not long after he first picked up a weapon. This was the place to be, the mead hall of a liege lord, where the festivities could go on for days. Here Sigurd hears all the epic tales of Viking warriors who came before him, whetting his appetite for what lies ahead.
In the middle there would be fire burning, and the chieftain that was hosting these festivities would have a special chair probably, and the most important guests will sit close to him. People were richly dressed, and scholds, so the poets, who had proclaimed their poems telling the stories of gods and heroes of the ancient past. Drinking was important, it really had very social importance. There were even ritual drinks, so Vikings would drink ale or mead from drinking horns. They were important also because during these ritual drinks, ritual toasts actually, oaths were sworn, speeches were given, even marriages were arranged, or even alliances.
Sigurd dreams that his own exploits will one day be a saga to be told. At the same time, he knows he doesn't want to join the Viking equivalent of the special forces, the so-called berserkers. Sigurd isn't quite that hardcore, however much courage the mead gives him. Berserkers were half men, half beast. When they attacked, they howled like mad dogs or wolves. They usually fought bare-chested, if not naked, or clothed in animal skins. In the midst of battle, they seemed to feel no fear, nor even pain. In peak berserker mode, they would kill indiscriminately, even men from their own side. Berserkers are a warrior legend that will live on forever, but we have proof they existed. In Viking culture, women were also expected to fight. Shield maidens were mythological female warriors, remarkably tough and fierce. We know Viking women, unlike many of their contemporaries, could own property and divorce their husbands. But did they really fight alongside their menfolk? Shield maidens feature heavily in Norse sagas and also crop up in the artwork of the time. But myth or reality, the jury is still out.
What usually happens is that the sex of a person who is buried is judged either by the human remains or by the goods that were buried with this person. So most of the times, if they found a person buried with weapons, they would assume it was a man. But recently, some scholars demonstrated that apparently one of the skeletons that was buried in Birka in Sweden and was buried with weapons was considered a man, but actually was a woman. So re-examining the human remains of this burial, they came to the conclusion that it was actually a woman, and so they wanted to demonstrate that Viking women warriors actually existed, as it is told in literature and in various legends.
Since he's old enough to drink in the mead hall, Sigurd is now ready to join a raiding party, setting out to sea in a longboat. These were sinister yet beautiful-looking vessels. In their day, the prow of a Viking longboat must have been as terrifying as the sight of a German U-boat periscope during World War II. More so, because when the Vikings dealt out devastation, it was up close and personal.
The chief bottom line of anything is the Vikings were probably the best shipbuilders that ever occupied the world. They knew how to build ships, and they knew how to keep the ships dry. They knew how to keep the ships light. They knew how to keep the ships flexible. They could lengthen them, but they knew also if they lengthened them, they had to make them thinner. If they widened them for cargo reasons, they had to make them shorter.
Well, they could even be 30 or 35 meters long. For example, judging from some Viking ships that were found in Roskilde in Denmark. The crew will be of 50 or even more men. They were long. They also have a very shallow draft. So that means that they were very maneuverable, but they were not very stable in high sea.
When they needed long ships, like the case of one in Roskilde, for example, it was long. It was quite long, quite narrow, held about 60 oars on each side, so about 120 oars total. And each oar could have one or more Vikings, so maybe around 250 Vikings in the vessel, counting those who would be the leaders and other things.
With as many as 250 warriors on board, it's remarkable just how swiftly the Viking longboats could plow through the waters.
Five or 6 knots, that means 10 kilometers per hour, and even an average speed of 7 knots when it was propelled by sail, with peaks of even 10 knots.
Back in Denmark, Sigurd Bjornsson has established himself as a key member of a raiding party. He has returned from each raid with booty and is now resplendent in new armor and the finest weapons. And from the looks of things, perhaps this wild young man could settle down with a nice Viking girl. But we wouldn't bet on it. Sigurd now not only dreams of glory, but of making himself rich. War? What is it good for? Well, for one thing, loot. In some ways, the Vikings were as much gangsters as they were warriors. In the 10th century, they set up the world's first ever protection racket. It was known as Danegeld and sometimes Herregeld. These were taxes levied by the Danes in Anglo-Saxon England, and in return for paying them, local chiefs could be fairly sure their township would not be targeted in the next Viking raid.
Danegeld sometimes misunderstood. It really was flexible. The Danegeld could be paid as a ransom to Vikings to stay away. It's like protection money to stay away from the towns. There could be a Danegeld paid by other Vikings to other Vikings. It could be a tax by Viking protectors of local peoples. That seems to be what it eventually comes to be, is Vikings who are settled but are now going to protect the locals with their skills, their military skills.
Flexible it might have been, but not to pay it was to invite retribution without mercy.
We know at least one famous example of, not strictly speaking a Danegeld, but a tribute that was not paid to the Vikings. And this story happened in 1012, when the Vikings arrived in Canterbury. They sieged the city, and then they asked for a tribute to be paid. And the population actually paid this tribute. But the archbishop was their prisoner. The Viking took him as a prisoner, and they asked for further money, for another sum, to free the archbishop. And apparently the archbishop didn't want the people to pay even more to free him. So eventually, during a Viking feast, when the Vikings were drunk, they killed him.
These kinds of episodes ensured that payments were invariably delivered in full and on time, and with each Danegeld payment, the Vikings gained in strength and kept returning with higher demands. Put it this way, the Danegeld in the year 990 AD was 11,500 ounces of silver. 22 years later, it had increased over 5,000% to 650,000 ounces of silver. From raiders, Vikings had evolved into loan sharks and protection rackets, giving them a permanent foothold in communities. Sigurd certainly has no qualms about taking the Danegeld, nor for that matter enforcing penalties on those who don't pay. In fact, he enjoys his work. But while the Vikings may have been pirates, looters, and loan sharks, they were also explorers. They were the first Europeans to reach North America, where they actually settled down in a few places.
After the periods of their raids, once they settled on the territories that they could visit, like on the Orkney or Shetland Islands, on the Faroe, on Iceland itself, so they for sure became agricultural people. They became people who could grow their crops, who could take care of their cattle, who could live a peaceful life, especially once they became Christian. So after the arrival of Christianity, they settled down, they put together their own local communities, and so if not hippies, they managed to survive in a less military way, we can say.
Pretty soon, certainly by the end of the 10th century, half of northern England is Anglo-Scandinavian. They now have so many Viking settlers. There's some idea that the ginger hair color in an Irishman comes from the Danes, because so many Danes had settled in Ireland, including founding the city of Dublin. So the Vikings, unlike many, many other raiding peoples, they did tend to spread out. The Rus were Vikings. So Russia, the Rus land, was Vikings. The Varangians, down in Byzantium and Bulgaria and other places along the rivers of the Dnieper and Volga River, those too were Vikings. So the Viking Scandinavians spread quite considerably.
This is Lons aux Meadows, a Viking settlement in Canada's Newfoundland territory. It's over 1,000 years old.
The site of Lons aux Meadows suggests that it was used as a base for further exploration, looking for resources. For example, some butternuts were found there, and we know that they grow only 800 kilometers south than Lons aux Meadows. That means that they will actually stop there and then travel again to reach other places.
The Vikings run amok seems from about 780 until about 1060. And we're not entirely certain why they stop. I mean, that's 2 centuries of pretty good running amok. Is it that the treasures became fewer? Is it that the more settlements began to take place? Is it the fact that places like Normandy established very strong governments? Is it Christianity that flows into these areas? Almost everybody is Christianized by the middle of the 11th century. All of those are possible.
A 2018 DNA map revealed the full extent of Viking bloodline spread over Britain and Ireland. The city of Dublin is known as a Viking city. Who knows? There may even be more Viking warrior in you than you think.
There's no doubt that Viking genetics will fill Europe, especially Northern Europe, with new Viking genetics. The English language is developed using Viking words frequently. So too is the cuisine. We probably wouldn't know salmon as a food without good Vikings that used it as a frequent means of changing their diet from hunting and gathering.
Although, thanks to the sagas, the westward Viking raids are relatively well known, their routes to the east were less well publicized. On a great night in the mead hall, Sigurd's warrior tribe pay host to a visitor from the east, a trader with trinkets from as far away as Constantinople. Sigurd can barely take his eyes off this exotic stranger. His clothes and manners seem different, but he too is a type of Viking. A Varangian, to be precise, or an Eastern Viking. The Varangians were 9th and 10th century Vikings who went eastward and southward through what is now Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine.
The difference between the Western Vikings and the Eastern Vikings is basically this, that the Western Vikings, those centered on Denmark, on Norway, will colonize the western part of the world known at the time, while the Varangians, mainly coming from Sweden, will colonize the eastern part of Europe, the Russian side of Europe, and they will receive the name of Rus by the people living there in the region of Novgorod. The Varangians succeeded in building their first Viking state.
Sigurd is drawn to the merchant and his tales of the Varangians. These Eastern Vikings who ruled over the medieval state of Kievan Rus, modern-day Ukraine, but roamed as far as the Mediterranean. In Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, they formed the Byzantine Varangian Guard, serving the Eastern Roman Empire.
The Varangian Guard that was formed in Byzantium was a group of individuals from the north, and they didn't all have to be Scandinavians. We know that Anglo-Saxons and French actually participated as well. It was a group that were mercenaries that had gone pretty much for reasons that we're told in some of the sagas the reasons could be as much as a crime, treason, something along these lines, and then they flee and get away and go for employment, and that's where they can get good employment. They were very, very strong elite warriors within the Byzantine army, and the Byzantines counted on them quite a bit.
So probably the Varangian Guard received the weapons from, the weapons were provided from the Eastern Empire. So they would receive helmets, probably with the chainmail protecting the neck. And then they would have also scale armors, so that was possibly different from what they would use in Scandinavia. And probably the most important difference was the shield. There was not a round shield anymore, but was a kite shield, bigger and longer shield that would protect a bigger portion of the body.
Sigurd was captivated by stories of the Varangian Guard, that elite band of Viking warriors who protect the Eastern Roman Empire. He dreams of going to Constantinople himself one day, but he may be on his way sooner than he thinks. A little too much flirtation with another warrior's intended bride results in a face full of mead for Sigurd Bjornsson. It's a challenge to his manhood that Sigurd dared not refuse. There is a traditional way for these kind of disputes to be settled, and it isn't by flipping a coin. The holmgang, or Viking trials by combat, were the accepted way of settling disputes. Whichever man won, well, his was the more just cause, for the gods had so willed it. And it was practical too, because as the holmgang was frequently a trial to the death, the loser wouldn't be around to complain.
Holmgang literally means to go to an island. The source that lists the rules of the Holmgang in a more detailed way is Cormac's saga. We know that a cloak was laid on the ground. They will actually measure 3 squares of 1 foot each around this cloak, and then put some hazel poles at the corners. So that field was then called Hazel Field. They will also make sacrifices before the duel and say some prayers. And then they will start fighting. Every fighter had the right to have 3 shields, and a companion of him would hold the shield during the fight, so actually contributing in a very active way to the duel. And when all the shields were destroyed, the fighters had to go on to the cloak and then fight with their weapons. The one who was challenged had the right to strike the first blow. When someone was wounded, the duel could actually stop, or they could decide to go on. And they were not supposed to step outside the area, the cloak.
In the end, Sigurd emerges the winner. But soon after, the consequences of his victory begin to sink in, as the family of his victim are influential in the Viking hierarchy and put pressure on Sigurd to leave. Perhaps it is time he too considered going east. The Viking world in the 10th century covers a lot of territory. Viking warriors really spread their wings. In their famed longboats, the Norsemen, literally men from the north, invaded England twice. They roamed as far as the Volga River in modern-day Ukraine and Russia. But then, by the mid-11th century, the Viking Age came to an abrupt end. But why?
The main reasons for which the Viking Age came to an end is really related to the developments going on in Europe and in the Western world around the 10th and the 11th century. At a certain point, the Vikings decided to settle down, to constitute and to create their own states. This happened in what is nowadays Normandy, which actually is the northern region of France, receiving its name by the Norsemen, Vikings, who settled down there around the 10th century. So they became sort of allies to Charles the Simple, the king of the Franks, and they decided to settle down there under their own ruler Rollo.
Who knows how long the Vikings themselves expected to last, or if they even thought about such things. Most Viking warriors did not live until old age. The Vikings believed that in the afterlife, the bravest warriors went to Valhalla, where they would spend their days battling each other. The nights would be given over to drinking, feasting, wine, women, and song. They'd all get up the next day and do it all over again. The whole point of life for the Vikings was to test oneself against adversity and then celebrate one's victories. But if the battle went against them, they would fight to the last man and embrace an honorable death, to live again in the afterlife. That was the Viking way. By Odin's eye, that was the warrior's way.
Vikings are an elite force, elite military force, in perhaps not in the way that they fought, perhaps not in the technology and tactics or their leadership. But they were an elite force in what they believed in the honor of fighting.
As a warriors, probably they can teach other warriors of other ages is the importance of surprise, of the courage of risk for more, seek for more, as a civilization rather than just simply warriors. Possibly the skill to adapt to different situations and also to merge with other populations.
And what of Sigurd? Having won his trial by combat, he is now having to face the consequences. If he stays where he is, Sigurd will always be looking over his shoulder, pretty sure that one day someone will avenge his victim's death. And so, remembering the tales of the East that had always enthralled him, Sigurd decides to make his way to Constantinople. His hope is to join the Varangian Guard, the Eastern Roman Emperor's own personal escort in Constantinople. Istanbul, once Constantinople. Looking at the city today with its Islamic landmarks, it seems an unlikely place for Vikings to have inhabited. We leave Sigurd as he arrives in Constantinople, hoping to join the Varangian Guard. He is at the crossroads, a little older and wiser, but still convinced that death in battle is the only way to live. Anyone who has ever looked into the glazed eyes of a soldier dying on a battlefield will think hard before starting a war. So said Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who was himself responsible for inciting the Prussian Wars of Independence. War is horrific, and yet, despite its carnage and senseless destruction, we can see heroism, endurance, and willpower that goes beyond the call of duty. In this series, we pay tribute to elite soldiers, men, and sometimes women, whose bravery and discipline speaks to us down the centuries. They lived by the sword, and they died by the sword. They followed the warrior's way. This is Julius Ubius, a Roman legionary who will not only have to fight the enemies of Rome, but also his own demons. It is early in the 1st century Common Era. The Roman Empire is expanding in all directions. At its peak, it will cover an area of around 5 million plus square kilometers. But in Germania, the birthland of Julius, the Roman legions encounter a fierce resistance from one of their greatest foes, the Teutonic tribes. For centuries, Roman legions were the enforcers of the Pax Romana, a familiar and feared presence throughout most of their known world.
Specifically regarding the ancient Romans, we could consider 3 things in particular that would render them cold and calculating as ice. 3 things: ICE, incentive, conviction, and execution. Incentive. You need to give one an incentive to do whatever job, especially when the task comes to letting loose the dogs of war. So you need a material incentive, economics, some financial gain. Among other things, there may be aspirations for not only glory in this world, but in the afterlife. That will lead to the second factor, namely conviction. If one is satisfied with the incentives, then one will be convinced to carry out the task, which leads to the third point, execution. Execution of tasks for the immediate as well as preparation, before battle, during battle, after battle.
Of course, over the centuries, there have been some who admired and even tried to copy Roman military might, usually for all the wrong reasons. But what made the Roman legion such a formidable fighting force?
Until the sack of Rome in 390, when a Gaulish army invaded Rome and sacked the city, Rome's army was not a standing army. It was an army composed of farmer soldiers. We find that the soldiers are becoming professionals. We're finding that their weaponry is mass-produced. We're finding that the Romans themselves are becoming a sufficient organized professional fighting force.
The Romans liked to boast that while they sometimes lost a battle, they seldom lost a war. But the Germanic tribes will put that theory to the test. More than once. And here is where things get complicated for our young hero, Julius Ubius. For Julius is actually an Ubi tribesman born on the left bank of the Rhine in a Roman-controlled part of Germania. His grandfather, who raises him, fought as a mercenary under Julius Caesar. His father, Willemut, serves as a foreign-born auxiliary soldier.
Prior to the ancient Romans, the vast majority of any troops were taken from the mercenary class, hired killers, basically. With the Romans, we have the creation of the world's first standing army, discipline, support. However, the Romans, being very pragmatic, maintained at least this vestige from ancient warfare tactics, the use of auxiliaries, primarily for defense of the standing army, that is, of the legion itself. So on the first attack, or the first series of attacks, the first to do so for the Romans would be their auxiliary troops.
The first duty of these vital support troops was to protect the legions. They would often march in front or guard the flanks. They were also paid less than half of the citizen soldiers, the legionaries. It's not surprising that there were sometimes uprisings or mutiny among the auxiliaries.
The auxiliaries are trained as if they are part of the Roman army, and they are, to all intents and purposes, part of the Roman army. But you've always got that problem with the auxiliary in that they could potentially be turncoats because they're not Roman citizens. They don't have loyalty to Rome that the standing army does have.
An auxiliary, like the father of Iulius, witnesses examples of that brilliant Roman strategy at work. He serves alongside the legions in Lycia, modern-day Turkey, and in Pannonia, the modern-day Balkans. He fights bravely, so bravely, in fact, that his service to the emperor is rewarded. After a couple of decades in the army, auxiliaries could finally become Roman citizens. It wasn't automatic, but citizenship would be awarded according to various criteria, such as one's importance. A chieftain was more likely to receive it than a common warrior. And the cultural assimilation of Roman ways, which could include one's haircut, diet, and dress. Although Iulius grows up in a Germanic settlement on the very fringes of the empire, he dreams of becoming a soldier. But not just any kind of soldier, a Roman legionary.
Well, it used to be in the British army, join the army and see the world. And I suppose in the Roman world, there was something of that too. I mean, you had the opportunity, particularly after the reign of Augustus, that the whole of the Mediterranean would possibly be your port of call as a Roman legionary. However, the postings could be around the Mediterranean, or they could be to the wild and brutish north. So I don't think it was primarily to see the world that a Roman legionary joined up. Regular pay, regular food in an unstable world, and a good pension. The possibility of a land allotment when you retired.
One day, after an especially long absence, the father of Iulius returns to his family. But there's something different about him, and it's not just a few more crow's feet or a couple of gray hairs.
In the Roman army, the foreigners, non-Roman citizens, needed to serve for military purposes for a period of 25 years. After this period, they could have the right to retire, they could have the right to become Roman citizen. So this is a very important point.
He shows his young son his Roman gladius, a symbol of his hard-won Roman citizenship. When it came to the auxiliaries, Roman citizenship was not always transferred from father to son. But these are trying times for Romans in the Rhineland. Conquering and controlling Germania is proving a much tougher task than even the Roman juggernaut was prepared for, and they need fresh blood in the ranks. And so it is, Julius, like his father, is made a citizen and admitted to the Roman legions. He soon leaves the village where he has grown up and spent nearly all his days to begin on the warrior's way. If Julius wants to be a Roman legionary as well as a citizen, he must first go in front of a recruiting commission. With his family background, he sails through. But then, like every other common soldier new to the legion, Julius would have had to start at the bottom and work his way up. That meant beginning as a munifex, a soldier with no rank, the equivalent of a private in today's army. A munifex could be called upon to chop wood, carry water, clean the latrines, and any other menial or dirty jobs as required.
An ordinary soldier could aspire to becoming a centurion and aspire to lead a cohort of troops. However, the upper echelons of the army were always members of the aristocracy.
So a new recruit, be it a 16-year-old boy somewhere in the Roman Empire, if they've decided that their forward momentum, their upward mobility would be to join the army, then that would begin with at the very least, a half a year, a 4 to 6 month period of intensive training, learning all of the basic fundamentals of being a legionary by oneself, as well as with the entire group, using the gladius properly, knowing how to defend oneself, and also remembering how to defend the rest of the unit, the cohort, the legion itself.
The fact is, even a common legionary was still a step and a pay grade up from being an auxiliary. And the uniform, weapons, and armor still command respect today.
The Romans were armed with 4 elements, basically. A shield, a scutum. Now, the scutum itself was a full body shield, which meant if the Roman crouched down behind it, they were guarded from chin to ankle. So they were covered with a piece of armor that was their fighting shield. And then a pilum. Now, the pilum was an interesting piece of equipment. It was a spear that was designed for throwing, but it wasn't just an ordinary spear.
The organization of the Roman army had changed over the years, and the unification of Roman equipment wasn't always the same. If we take the Roman army at the time of the Republic or the first emperors, the level of standardization was high. That means, essentially, a fighter got weapons as part of his gear and had to use those he was given. Over time, as the Roman army changed more and more, they had the possibility for their own, let's say, personal weapons. Now, given that many of the soldiers weren't of Roman origin, it led to some barbarism of the army, both ethnically and with respect to their weapons. So, by the time of the late Empire and the migration period, the weaponry had completely changed. However, at the peak of the Roman Empire, we can assume that the legionnaires were practically all armed the same way.
The Roman javelin, or pilum, was a little over 2 meters long and, of course, lethal. Even when they didn't kill or injure an opponent, they could still put them out of business. These spears would bend on impact and stick in their enemies' shields. Since pilum javelins were so tough to dislodge, the enemy could not simply throw them back at the Romans. And since their own shields were now useless, they had to be discarded. Now vulnerable, the Roman soldier would come at his opponent with sword and dagger. The famed gladius, or short sword, was light and maneuverable, ideal for quick stabbing motions. The gladius was worn high on the right side of the body. It could be drawn underarm by the right hand without getting in the way of the shield, which a legionary carried in his left.
Another important weapon of Roman legionaries was the Pugio dagger. Basically, we can imagine it as a small sword. It was a short stabbing dagger with a relatively wide blade and a variety of handles that actually copied the shape of the gladius sword to something similar. Obviously, this dagger was only for close combat and wasn't used in combat unless the conditions were optimal. Remember, the Roman army relied more on tactics and the overall organization of the battle and troops than on the individual performances.
Let's not forget the legionary's shield. After all, it was his first line of defense in battle. But how can we be so sure of what they looked like? Today, the Yale University Gallery houses the only surviving scutum, or Roman shield. It seems like a work of art, but had a very practical purpose. The best known use of the shield was when troops advanced in the testudo, or tortoise formation, a kind of shield wall. This formation was employed during siege warfare when troops advanced under fire.
The famous testudo formation, that is the tortoise formation, using their scuta, the shields, and short-edged swords for close-range combat in conjunction with their other defenses, their other defense mechanisms.
They were virtually impenetrable. They were like a tank made up of individuals that were working together in unison. And that's fine for the Romans, and it's fine for the open warfare. They even adopted the same thing at sea.
These highly disciplined bodies of men, with their uniforms and battle tactics, would conquer much of the known world. However, when the legions entered Germania, they began to see the limits of tried and tested tactics.
When they move into the northern lands, when they go beyond the Alps, and particularly when they go beyond the Rhine and enter a different type of terrain, this type of formation warfare doesn't work. You cannot assemble a legion in a testudo in a forest. There is just not the space for it. And of course, the whole military machine falls apart in a forested terrain.
For forested terrain, the Roman war machine needed to develop more versatile and nimble battle tactics than it had traditionally used. But even as Roman legionaries at the front were having to adapt to new realities, at the rear of the Roman army, life remained unchanged. Everything from life in the barracks to morning reports, from working in shifts to field hospitals, from the right to receive a pension, all the way to field entertainment concert parties for the troops. All of this was already standard practice in the Roman legions. By the time Julius is old enough to think about becoming a soldier, the legions have chalked up many victories on the board. But they have yet to face their fiercest, most formidable enemy. "50 years before Julius was born, in 52 BCE, the most famous Roman general of them all, Julius Caesar, won perhaps his greatest victory. The battle, or siege, of Alesia. He was up against Vercingetorix, the most feared and clever of warriors in ancient Gaul.
With the Battle of Alesia, we are in the year 52 before Common Era. It's a battle celebrated as one of the greatest Roman victories, or one of the greatest victories of Julius Caesar against his enemy Vercingetorix.
Julius Caesar famously decides in a stroke of true military genius to bring the war to one of Rome's more famous great enemies, the Celts. And therein lies the famous series of battles with the chieftain leader of the Celts, Vercingetorix, who had, Caesar himself would probably admit, great charisma, and among the Celts, also a great knowledge of their own style of combat and warfare, which leads us to the famous Battle of Alesia, in which the Celts presumed themselves to be at the advantage, that is, to remain fortified in the citadel that they had constructed for themselves.
The Siege of Alesia was a showcase for Roman strategic and tactical genius. Over 6 weeks, Caesar's troops built 2 rings of defensive fortifications around the town to stop reinforcements from reaching the Gauls.
What Caesar did was set up a 10-mile wall around the city, hemming Vercingetorix and his troops in their winter quarters, basically there to starve Vercingetorix. Even when a relief force was sent to attack Caesar's troops, he thought about it and had prepared a second rampart, 15 miles in circumference, to defend his own troops. So we have a double rampart around the city, hemming in the Gauls and keeping out the Gauls, looking inwards and looking outwards.
Once inside the town, it was a massacre. Some 40,000 Gauls were slain before their leader, Vercingetorix, finally surrendered to Caesar and was taken to Rome in chains. The strategy of most armies of the day could be summed up as gather your fiercest warriors together and then charge wildly at the enemy and give it all you've got. This was crude, but could be effective until you encountered the Romans.
To this day, it is true that wars are won with logistics, and not nearly with the bravery of specific fighters. Julius Caesar once said that he won all of his battles with a spade, meaning groundworks, fortifications, and so on, as we can see in the Siege of Alesia.
Josephus, in his text, Jewish War, writes verbally their drills, the drills of the Romans, were bloodless battles, and their battles were bloody drills. So we can already see from here, from these words, the strict connection that existed between the training at the level of the troops and the reality of the war. So training, drills, all this was very important for the Roman soldier because by means of doing this, he basically prepared himself on a daily basis for the reality of war, which was a constant kind of element in the life of the Republic, the first period, but also in the period of the Roman Empire as well.
New recruits to the Legion were also instructed in practical matters, such as setting up camp, building fortifications, and digging trenches, and marching, always marching.
The Roman training was that they would actually, as part of their training, train with full kit on route marches of 20 kilometers or 20 miles a day?
Well, for a legionary, one who was in full service to the Roman army as a legionary, typically had a pack of somewhere around 20 kilos or 40 to 50 pounds that they would have to march with, they were expected to march with every day for as many as 15 to 20, sometimes 25 miles a day. This pack included obviously their own armor, their shield, the gladius, a few other implements of battle, not to mention utensils for cooking. Each roughly group of 8 to 10 legionaries would also have assigned to individuals to take care of whatever extra needs that they might have as well.
All that marching instills discipline, something even modern-day armies still swear by. Recruits had to practice carrying weights of up to 60 pounds, running, leaping, vaulting, and swimming, and weapons training using slingshot, bow and arrows, sword, and javelin. All that, and, well, even more marching.
The constant Roman legion practice of drilling troops served a number of purposes. One, for the sake of maintaining what a legionary had already learned years earlier as a new recruit in training. Drilling keeps you fresh, keeps you sharp, keeps you ready, because at any moment, you never know when you will be called into direct service in military combat.
When on campaign, and even after a long day's march, Roman soldiers would usually have to set up a camp, complete with a ditch and a defensive wall of wooden stakes. And, as if that wasn't enough, they would be expected to get up the next day and do it all over again. Failure to do so would result in the most severe of punishments.
So we have an interesting case from this point of view. So the first century general Domitius Corbulo once had to punish a soldier, one of his soldiers. Why? Just because he was digging a trench without having with him his own sword. And what kind of punishment did he decide to give to the soldier? Death. So he was executed on the spot just because he forgot to bring together with him his sword.
Punishments could be extended beyond the individual and be applied to an entire cohort of men. A classic example was the so-called decimation, or 1 in 10 punishment.
The decimation also is an interesting kind of punishment that you can have as a Roman soldier when it's not really possible to identify specific individual responsibilities. In that case, the entire group of people, the entire cohort maybe, is punished by the general. How? By reducing the number of its components by the 10%. Basically, this means that 1 out of 10 will be executed.
Lucky for Julius, he escapes the worst punishments meted out in training and is sworn in as a new Roman legionary. Step forward, new recruit Julius Ubius, and swear by the gods of Rome, the names of your ancestors, and your own honor, an unbreakable oath, that you will follow your commander wherever he may lead you. You will obey orders enthusiastically and without question. You relinquish the protection of the Roman civil law and accept the power of your commander to put you to death without trial for disobedience or desertion. You promise to serve under the standards for your allotted time of duty and not to leave before your commander discharges you. You will serve Rome faithfully, even at the cost of your life, and will respect the law with regards to civilians and your comrades in camp. You are now a soldier of Rome. Soon, Julius will march off to join the legion on campaign. The year is 15 CE. At that time, the Romans were fighting wars on many fronts and, in most cases, winning them. But the exceptions to Roman dominance were spectacular. When Julius is sworn in, it is only a few years since Arminius, chieftain of the Germanic Cherushi tribe, led an alliance of Germanic tribes at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. This was a humiliating and costly defeat for the Romans, in which 3 Roman legions were virtually wiped out.
In the year 9 CE, happens the famous Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. It's possibly the worst defeat for the Roman army ever.
The Roman legions, the 3 Roman legions, found themselves in an unknown land, flanked by their auxiliary cavalry, which they assumed would defend them, but in actual fact turned upon them and slaughtered them to a man.
The Auxiliaries, trained in Roman military ways but treated as second-class soldiers, could sometimes mutiny and turn on their masters as they did at Teutoburg.
Arminius, the leader of the Cherushi Germans, so he had promised to General Varus to help the Romans. Arminius used to be quasi-Roman individual because he had been living in Rome for many years as an hostage in the past.
Arminius of the Auxiliaries may have promised to help the Roman legions in the Rhineland, but this was all a front. He, in fact, had a very different plan in mind. And that was to betray the legions, leading them into hostile territory, and then turning the might of the Auxiliaries against them. The Roman historian Paterculus wrote, "Hemmed in by forests and marshes and ambuscades, the Roman army was exterminated almost to a man by the very enemy whom it had always slaughtered like cattle." Teutoburg was such a crushing defeat that it became known as the Varian disaster, after Varus, the vanquished Roman commander.
So the Roman legions, famously or infamously, had suffered losses prior to the 1st century with the Celts, the Carthaginians, but the nature of their loss, one of the more famous losses in the Teutoburg Forest in Germany, was due to perhaps 2 factors that the Romans had not been prepared for. They basically entered the fray not keeping in mind 2 important considerations. One, that they were not on their own turf. They were preparing to battle on enemy territory, not playing on their home field, so to speak. Secondly, the terrain itself, the topography. One of the things that rendered the ancient Roman military war machine effective was their construction of the famous ancient roads. Entering the territory of various Germanic tribes. They did not have that luxury, that necessity, really. Secondly, the terrain itself, apart from the occasional plains, was scattered with a variety of dense forests. And that directly affected the Roman military strategy in fighting.
Familiar with Roman ways, Arminius also has both the advantage of surprise and of fighting on his home turf and terrain on which he was entirely comfortable. Advantages that prove devastating.
I suppose, in a nutshell, the sort of interest, the difference between the Germanic warrior, the individual Germanic warrior, and the Roman fighting machine is really summed up in the career of Arrhenius himself. This is a young chieftain who is taken to Rome as a 10-year-old hostage, brought up in Rome, and trained as a Roman soldier. He's trained as a Roman soldier, but because he's Germanic, of German origin, is not put in the army, but is given command as a chieftain's son. His royal lineage is respected, given command of an auxiliary cavalry unit. And that's quite something. He's learned Roman tactics, but is not absorbed into the army proper, but is fighting with the army and is fighting on horseback. So he's not an ordinary soldier marching with the squaddies, but actually given command of a large troop of horsemen.
3 Roman legions were wiped out in 15 CE at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. The 17th, 18th, and 19th, between 2,600 and 3,000 men. Their eagle standards were captured, the ultimate humiliation and disgrace for a Roman legion.
So the military standard was very important for the Roman troops. It identified the specific point where all the troops had to regroup or had to look at. During battle, it was also a means of communication in the age in which they didn't really have.
The Roman eagles represented the army, the Roman standards. The eagles were carried by the standard bearer. They were the first into battle. It was the rallying point of the entire legion. When you entered the legion, you were expected to defend the legion's honor, and the legion's honor was embedded in the eagle, the symbol of the legion. And you would expect to fight to a man to defend the eagle. If the eagles were lost, it meant complete dishonor.
After the terrible experience, the terrible defeat of Teutoburg, the Romans, a few years later, they tried to go there again. So they try again that expedition to the German territories with Germanicus. So Germanicus tried more than once to conquer, and they actually managed to advance through the German territory beyond the Rhine River. He also managed to recover 2 of the standards that had been lost at Teutoburg a few years before.
The mission is further proof of Roman determination. Remember, it was said that while the Romans may have lost battles, they seldom lost a war. Recapturing the eagles would restore some wounded pride. Still, it can't have been anyone's dream assignment. The Romans would have to adapt, in a sense. They had to fight like the Germanic tribes. Because of his Germanic background, Julius is made an explorator, a scout. sent to reconnoiter the movements and deployments of the enemy. But then, the Watchers are detected.
In battling these various Germanic tribes in the 1st century, they were forced into guerrilla warfare.
Julius becomes separated from his centuria after an attack by Germanic tribal warriors. Now lost and alone in the forest, this Roman son of a Germanic warrior must do everything to avoid being caught by men who are, after all, his own kith and kin. After these raids, the Romans never again tried to advance east of the Rhine, and these territories were never incorporated into the empire. But the Germanic tribes that had united under Arminius would never forget the Roman incursion into their lands. And it was from those same eastern lands that the ultimate Roman nemesis would eventually emerge. Around 400 years after the Battle of Teutoburg, German Gothic forces under the leadership of Alaric I became the first foreign enemy to enter and sack Rome in 800 years.
History is always written from the point of view of the victor. And although the Romans were not successful in Germany, ever to any great extent, they did have a great propagandist in Tacitus, who writes his great history of the Roman campaigns in Germany. And he presents us with a picture of barbarians, which in actual fact is purely propaganda, probably.
Posterity is now the last thing on the mind of Julius Ubius. His focus is purely on survival. It's ironic. Part of what ultimately saves Julius are the survival skills he learned as the son of a German living by and in the woods. But it's his iron discipline as a legionary which sustains him. And he is in no doubt where his allegiances lie: to the Eagle Standard, the Legion, and to Rome. Julius, the citizen soldier, has found himself and will live and die defending the honor of Rome, which, for centuries, is as much about an idea of nationhood as it is physical borders.
The north-eastern border, the border separating the Roman world and the Germanic world, was a peculiar one. It was very wide. There were so many different tribes, Germanic tribes, pushing to enter the Roman world on that side. They were actually eager to enter the Roman world, and to some extent they were already part of the Roman world, because they were doing their daily business with the Romans, they were trading, they were also fighting for the Romans as allies, as federati, as we say.
But by the 5th century CE, the Pax Romana was steadily crumbling. As the tribes of Germania and Gaul began to flex their muscles against the yoke of Rome.
The Roman Empire then collapsed also under the wave of this mass of populations eager to enjoy what the Roman territories could have for them.
Trying to understand the decay, the decline, the eventual fall, collapse of the ancient Roman Empire in the 5th century, 476, remains the subject of much scholarly debate and discussion. A few things that we can say with certainty that led to this demise, and it's directly connected to the military war machine in ancient Rome.
The Roman warrior, if we want to consider him the Roman great general, didn't stop with Caesar, didn't stop with Trajan, but continued into the 4th and 5th centuries with the great general Belerius, for example. So we find that although Rome had fallen, the Roman mentality continued right up until 1453 with the Roman Empire in the East.
Rome wasn't built in a day, nor did it fall in a day. In the end, all 3 eagle standards that were lost at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest were recaptured. But the aura of invincibility around the glory and greatness of Rome had been lost forever. I hate war as only a soldier who has lived it can, only as one who has seen its brutality, its futility, its stupidity. So said Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces at D-Day. Most of us would agree. And yet, despite its carnage and senseless destruction, we can see bravery, toughness, and tenacity, the kind that also speaks to the best in humanity. In this series, we pay tribute to warriors, men, and sometimes women, whose stories speak to us down the centuries. Whether fighting the good fight or defending a lost cause. They followed the warrior's way. The Mongol warriors were as feared as any soldiers have ever been. The Mongols, on the attack, showed no mercy. What must it have been like to fight alongside these tribesmen from the Great Steppe, to have been part of one of the greatest armies in history, the Mongol Horde? Knubish, for that is his name, is one such warrior, a Mongol cavalryman. Knubish has had a tough childhood, even by Mongol standards. The name Knubish actually means not human and was once a popular Mongol name, since it was believed that it would protect the child from evil spirits. Knubish is an orphan whose childhood is spent among distant relatives. It's a tough start in tough times. In some respects, his backstory is like that of the greatest of all Mongol warriors, Genghis Khan, who lived around 180 years before the time of Knubish. Unlike the great Khan, Knubish is not destined for glory and fame, but he is still a moving part of the massive yet intricate Mongol war machine.
Well, the Mongols were the most ruthless people that probably ever existed. I think as a warrior class, as warriors, they had the least value of human life. There was no regard for anybody who lived. You know, if you gave up any resistance to the Mongols, you died, and they had no care about that. Sometimes if they went into a town and decided that they needed to move on, they would ransom any artisans out. So if you could bake bread or you could make something, you were in pretty good shape. If you weren't, that was it, you were dead.
Genghis Khan's cry of "feed the horses" might sound innocent enough, but those very words, "feed the horses," were the Mongol army's signal to slaughter, rape, and pillage a civilian population. In those days, there was almost no such thing as a male civilian population in Mongolia. Virtually every Mongol man was either a soldier or supported the military in some capacity. Being a warrior was a way of life and a highly disciplined one. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the great Khans of the Mongol Empire carved out the largest empire the world has ever seen, and maybe ever will see. And Mongol cavalry were the vanguard for the armies of that empire, striking terror into the hearts of their enemies for over 150 years. Their brutality was legendary. But when you dig deeper into Mongol history, you realize they were, of course, remarkably more subtle and complex.
The Mongols succeeded because of their discipline, their speed and their discipline, and the awe in which they were held. They fought in small groups of very mobile cavalry. It was certainly a professional army. The name Horde is from a Mongolian word, Ordu, which in fact means the camp. I think that's probably where this idea of the Horde came from. But no, they were an extremely disciplined force. And again, they may have appeared to be one huge horde, one mass, but in fact they were working in small, sometimes independent groups which could come together when the occasion demanded.
Renowned for their ferocity, Mongol cavalry attacked with lightning speed and devastating effectiveness with the bow and arrow. Pure warriors who fought during winter, unlike those lazy Europeans. They were the fighting force that spearheaded conquest of the largest ever empire by landmass in world history. The Europeans called them devils when they were first confronted with them in the 13th century. Of course, European armies were no strangers to savagery themselves, but none were more violent than the Mongols, who massacred millions in their frenzy of conquest.
In looking at military societies throughout history and how good some were, some are there because they simply expand, like the Romans, they simply expand, they take over, and that's that. The Ottomans did the same thing. The Mongols, they ruled in fear. They would sweep in, they'd sweep through a place, they took everything that wasn't tied down, nailed down, they burned everything else, they killed everybody else, and so they left. And there was often a time when nobody would rule in that place, would come into that area, even though the Mongols had left, because they were scared to death that they were on the Mongol frontier and that they would return.
There is no doubt that to ride with a Mongol horse soldier, Kanubish would have to be a trained killer, willing even to commit what today would be considered war crimes. But let's not forget, these were warlike days.
We are speaking about Middle Ages. This was the age of brutality from our point of view. Especially, for example, when we are mentioning that Mongols were able to destroy the whole cities and kill everybody if the city did not give up before the battle. This was something usual. This was something that was somehow natural even for the European warriors.
They deliberately encouraged this reputation. They encouraged this. Why? Because it was a method of being cruel to be kind. People were so in awe of them and so frightened that they, in fact, often surrendered without a fight.
The Mongols were past masters at psychological warfare, as well as physical warfare. One story about Mongol brutality which persists is of the pyramids of decapitated enemy skulls the Mongols were said to have built.
The story about the pyramids, the towers of skulls, is a true story, but in fact it applies to Tamerlane. Now, Tamerlane is often associated or often connected with the Mongols, but strictly speaking, he was from a different era and from a different armies. He rose to power after the fall of the Chinggisids, after the empire basically fell, and his aim was to recreate the emperor of Genghis Khan, and he was known for his ferocity, for his cruelty, and for these pyramids of skulls.
Said on fairly good authority to have stacked 55,000 skulls in a heap after he invaded India. Brought back some 55,000 carts of gems and jewels and gold and all sorts of things. But in doing so, he killed masses of numbers of people. Tamerlane captured the Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid I, and used to cart him around. Bayezid finally beat his skull until his brains poured out, and he died of suicide, which would have been for an Ottoman Sultan the greatest of humiliations. And Tamerlane seemed not to have bothered at all. Just buried him along the way. That was it.
The Mongol hordes maintained their reputation for savagery and brutality for over 250 years. But what was it about these mounted marksmen that made them such effective warriors? How was a relatively small army of cavalry and foot soldiers from the steppes of Eurasia able to conquer most of the known world? The key to the Mongols' success in battle and in building their vast empire was their unique relationship with the animal at the heart of their culture and way of life, the horse.
Their chief means of doing so was the horse, and actually not even a horse, we'd probably call it a pony. They were rather small. And the Mongols developed a society around them, especially a military society around them. Every warrior had at least 3 or 4 that he strung along with him. He would change mounts if one needed. He would eat the horse when it tired or died. He would drink the mare's milk when he was thirsty, and he would use the saddle to cook his food, place the raw meat in between the horse and the saddle, and probably wasn't the most tasty of delights, but seemed to exist that way. And so the society changed, the military society changed the world.
It said that children could ride a horse before they could walk. We don't know if that's literally true, but it could well be. So I think this combined with their discipline is why they were so effective. Well, again, I mean, they're famous for their small, very powerful bows, which they could famously fire behind them. They could turn in the saddle and fire behind them. And this is, again, is an art they would have learned from very young.
There has likely been no rider of horses in the world that surpasses a Mongol warrior at his height. The Mongols had small ponies. They knew how to pasture them. They knew how to herd them. They knew how to feed them on the march. They knew what they needed to eat. They knew how much water they needed. They knew how to use every facet of the horse if it was living, and they knew every facet of the horse if it had died. They understood there was, the Romans saw their precursors, the Huns, they saw them as men and horse together, not as separate individuals. And I think the Mongols have that similar idea later on. We can talk about knights and their horses, we can talk about anybody and their horses, and they do not match like a Mongol and his horse does. He could live on that horse, he could sleep on that horse, he could shoot arrows off the back of that horse, he could conduct cavalry raids off that horse, and he also knew when to simply get off and pasture and sleep next to it.
Mongol horses were tough, durable, and fast. Every Mongol cavalryman had 4 or even more horses, switching from one to another during a campaign, which meant no one horse was ridden until exhausted. This meant the Mongol army could move much faster than any other fighting force of the time, often covering 60 to 100 miles in a day. The Mongol way was that of the warrior, but it was also the way of the nomad.
The nomads usually tend to have a particular style of war. Of course, they were using their horses, which means that they were mounted warriors. They were able to move from place to place with a high speed. They were using bows or spears, which means that they were able to surprise their enemies. They could fight, they could pretend that they are escaping the battle, but on the other way, they were able to turn around very swiftly and surprise the enemy with a sudden impact, even after a very long period of escape.
The camps, the ordus, were more like mobile cities. Giovanni, the Persian historian, he's known for his prose. He wrote a history of Genghis Khan. He was an eyewitness. Now, the point about Giovanni is this. He learned his arrogance, he learned his sophistication in Mongol ordus, in camps. He was brought up in a Mongol camp. Why is this so? Is that in the camps, representatives from all the leading families were there. They were the sons and the daughters. Well, they were hostages, effectively, but comfortable hostages.
History and peoples are always more complicated than the stereotypes. Travel to Mongolia today, and leaving the modern and developed capital Ulaanbaatar behind, you'll discover that many rural Mongolians still lead nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyles in the grasslands, families living together in large circular tents, the famed yurt, just as they have for centuries. They are constantly on the move with their herds in search of fresh grazing grounds. The Mongolians who thrive in this harsh yet picturesque landscape would not trade it for all the riches of modern civilization. Perhaps you need to sit around a campfire on the Great Steppe, sipping Mongolian milk vodka under a blanket of stars to truly understand. Today, the Mongolians' deadliest enemy may be the fast encroaching modern world. But this is how it's been for almost a millennia. Canubish understood it, and he is from 800 plus years ago. Some people are born loners, and he is one of them. Then again, he is never quite alone. There is almost always one of his horses for company.
What puts the Mongol on top of the warlike societies is probably that they were, from the birth to the old age, organized as an army, even in simple and usual aspects of their life. They were really taught to fight since they were kids.
Canubish would have been trained from boyhood to fight, ride, and shoot. Shooting arrows from horseback is the defining characteristic of a Mongol warrior. But what weapons were used in close-quarter combat?
The Mongols were great horse archers. That's what made them. All steppe archers were really good horse archers. Well, the Mongols seem to have been able to twist in their saddle and to shoot their arrows off the rear of the horse, thus not having the head of the horse ever distract them. This made them greatly accurate. It also endeavored them to continue to shoot arrows while the horse is riding. That gave the Mongols an advantage over anybody who was stayed in one position or could not chase them and do the same.
The nomadic bow was an interesting weapon. It was much shorter than the European longbow. Obviously, it was necessary for the bow to be shorter in order to be used as a mounted weapon. Nomads were able to fight even behind their back because they were able to stand in their saddles and they were able to shoot behind them, which was key for example, the pretended escapes.
Mongol armies included heavy cavalry units, which, like their European counterparts, carried lances and wore metallic armor and swords and daggers for close-quarter combat. But the mounted bowmen we think of as Mongol cavalry wore light armor, very light in some instances.
Genghis said they used to wear silk undergarments, and this is because if you are shot with an arrow, the silk will not stop it exactly, but it will absorb it. And then the point of the arrow doesn't actually cut through the silk. So it's easy to pull the arrow out using the silk. And you pull the silk out, that will pull most of the arrow out as well. It will limit the damage done.
They wore the silk, and they wore it well as defensive armament, even if it could not compete with greatest of iron armors that were in the world. It still had a wonderful ability to stop an arrow before penetrating and dirtying a wound enough for infection to set in. We've got interesting stories about Mongols living for a very long time being wounded with things that should have killed them otherwise. And I think one of the conclusions that the historians have come by is that the silk is particularly strong, but also particularly hygienic.
As a way of both honing their fighting skills and gathering meat for a huge feast, the Mongols held an annual great winter hunt during which thousands of horsemen gathered. Any warrior who failed to kill an animal could expect to hang his head in shame. Kanubish is quietly confident as he goes on his first nurge.
During the hunt, they were using certain military tactics, and they were learning to fight by that way. They should circle around the animals, and if any warrior would let any animal escape, it would mean that he will be severely punished. By this way, they were trained for the battles.
The Great Winter Hunt, or nurge, was a cruel business. But Kanubish is proud to have taken part in it.
The nurge, which again all Mongols participated in, they would form a circle. This could be hundreds of kilometers in diameter. The idea was to capture all livestock, all animals within that circle. They would do this by slowly constricting the circle. This is over hundreds of miles. Slowly, bit by bit, they would constrict the circle and push all animals within it into the center. This took intelligence. They had to send signals to each other where animals were grouping, where they were. So a lot of skills were learnt. And again, this would go on for days on end, pushing these animals to the center. And it's said by the time the circle narrowed to a small area, the animals were going absolutely wild, crazy, but they were not allowed to let them die. Only when the commander called a halt to the nurge would the captain or the highest ranking person be allowed to kill an animal, and then there would be a bloodthirsty feast, and the animals, of course, would be saved for the winter.
One noble tradition that has survived down the generations is the eagle hunt. The bond between Mongol hunter and eagle remains as strong today as ever. It is nice to see that some things don't change. 900 years ago, the Mongols were a warlike race whose main preoccupations were hunting, survival, and fighting each other. The Mongolian steppe had no real borders, and the Mongols respected none anyway. They believed it was their destiny to conquer the world. But if they were ever going to conquer the world, they would need a leader. Cometh the hour, cometh the man, as the saying goes. Genghis, also pronounced Chinggis, Genghis, or Zhinggis, original name Temujin, was and is one of the most famous conquerors in all history. Born in 1162, all sorts of legends grew up around Genghis Khan, such as the tale that he was born with a blood clot in his little hand, a sign of things to come. Like Kanubish, Genghis Khan had a difficult childhood. He was born the son of a Yaka Mongol chief. However, when he was 10, his father was poisoned and his mother kidnapped. Genghis became chief, but the tribe abandoned him. And for a while, he was forced to survive on his wits, digging roots for food and stealing sheep, before he was able to return to his tribe to prove himself worthy to lead it.
One of the things the secret history of the Mongols tells us is that Genghis had a hard life as a child. Genghis Khan, mom is abducted. Then he had problems with his brothers. Well, Mongols always had problems with his brothers. In fact, Genghis' own sons had problems, and grandsons had problems with each other. His family was dishonored and been exiled from the tribe. That seems to be the case as well. That could have happened, I suppose, to other people. But the fact that all of these things together happened to Genghis, and yet he rises above them all, gives him an origin story that's not unlike those that even today tug at our heartstrings. It must have tugged at the heartstrings of many people who he encountered and thought, well, can I trust this guy? Should I follow him? Well, look at how he's done. Look at what he's raised himself to be.
Genghis Khan's first historic feat was to unite the warring tribes on the Great Steppe into a unified Mongolia.
Before 1206, the various tribes, the Mongols, Tatars, Nayman, Kerites, all of these various Turco-Mongol tribes spent their lives fighting each other. Genghis Khan united them. He dissolved this tribal system. And amazingly successful. He abolished the tribes, and that's why they all became Mongols. He divided the various units into units of 10. 10 men were under the command of a leader of 10. Those leaders of 10 were under the command of a leader of 100. Those leaders of 100 were under the command of a leader of 1,000, up to the leaders of 10,000. These were the elites. These were the chosen, handpicked by Genghis Khan himself, whose loyalty was beyond question. These leaders of 10,000.
Once that insanely difficult task had been accomplished, Genghis then set about extending his empire into Persia and China and oversaw the Mongols' first victorious encounter with the Russians. Khan was a military genius to rival Alexander the Great or Napoleon. Genghis Khan's military genius could quickly adapt itself to changing conditions. A good example, when he set out on his trail of conquests, practically all his troops were cavalry. This was fine when it came to defeating other armies of nomads, such as rival Mongolian tribes. But as they pushed into China, they began to encounter the problem of having to lay siege and penetrate cities. Genghis Khan captured some enemy engineers and offered them a choice between a slow and painful death or serving in the Great Khan's army.
So when they moved into China, they had very little experience of siege warfare, but they learnt. Why? Because they incorporated other armies, other peoples.
It wasn't long before the Mongols were able to lay siege to large cities, using trebuchets, siege towers, catapults, burning oil, and all the machinery and techniques of siege warfare. In this way, they were able to capture Zhengdu, or as we better know the city today, Beijing. Later, the Jin Emperor Aizong committed suicide there, rather than be taken by Genghis Khan. Virtually the whole world was seeing the consequences of trifling with the Mongol horde. Ultimately, Genghis Khan came to rule an empire which extended from northeast China to the Caspian Sea, in total an astounding 28 million square kilometers. But all things must pass. Not long after being thrown from his horse, Genghis Khan died in 1227 from internal bleeding. Even without Genghis, the Mongols were able to continue his warrior tradition. They were smart enough to know they didn't know everything. They had no hesitation copying from the Persian or the Chinese art of war. It was the Chinese who introduced them to gunpowder.
Historians have for a long time resisted giving the nomadic peoples the credit for using and diffusing gunpowder. But it seems to be our only conduit between the East and the West, as the Mongols. Historians have now gone back through, and especially looking at those campaigns in the early 13th century, and recognizing that the Mongols did use gunpowder weapon.
They used it as a very crude bombs. They used it as flamethrowers. They would attach it, and crude bombs, not very efficient bombs. They would try to, for example, put these bombs underneath walls and blow them up. But again, they weren't that efficient. But certainly, gunpowder started to be used, and the Mongols started to use it.
With gunpowder, the Mongol armies became even more fearsome adversaries. Brutal, by all means, yes, but they were also clever tacticians, skilled cavalrymen riding swift horses. The Mongols were capable of all sorts of quick, nimble maneuvers that would catch their foes off guard. The Mongols' repertoire of maneuvers included ambushes, hit and run, and wave attacks. Then there was the so-called feigned retreat, in which the Mongols would fake defeat and flee. The enemy would follow and be led into an ambush.
One of the most famous techniques was the feigned retreats, and this worked again and again, even though they became famous for it. They would often pretend to give up. They wouldn't surrender, they would just turn and flee. And without fail, the armies would chase, they would call them cowards, and of course this was a technique. They would simply move the battle to a different location, more advantageous to them. And then they would suddenly turn and ambush the pursuing army.
Naturally, these kind of hairpin turns as part of battle strategy were based on reliable sources of information. And it is the mission in life for Canubish to be part of the Mongols' 13th century intelligence network. Because the Mongols deployed networks of scouts and spies, men like Canubish, these messengers were vital. Before mounting a major attack, the Mongols would spend months scouting enemy defenses, supply lines, and possible escape routes. It was the practical application of what the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War. Every battle is won before it's ever fought.
Mongols were using a lot of elements of psychological warfare. Especially they were trying to pretend that their army is much bigger than it really was. They were, for example, mounting their slaves or wives or kids, or even just taking the horses without riders together in order to look much numerous. They were using the branches of trees in order to produce enormous clouds of dust. This way they could somehow surprise their enemies, and they could also appear from an unexpected place because of the dust, because of the element of surprise, and because of the speed of their horses.
In our story, Canubish is made a messenger and scout in the Mongol army, which suits his disposition just fine. In many ways, he has always felt closest to animals. The eagles that he has hunted with since he was a boy, the horses that carry him on his way and never complain or make fools of themselves when they drink, like some humans he knows. A solitary life is no hardship for Canubish, but he cannot begin to imagine the importance of the messages he will one day deliver to all corners of the vast Mongol Empire.
Mongols were using a very sophisticated system of messengers or envoys. It was, let's say, the key organization of their vast empire. They really need to travel or to send messages from place to place very swiftly. By this, they used certain stations where the envoy could change the horse and travel with the swiftest speed as it was possible. By this way, even hundreds of kilometers could be crossed during one day. Of course, every envoy had the same military training as a usual warrior.
Long-distance communication in the Mongol Empire was based on supply or message routes known as the yam. A yam was a system of relay stations used by the Mongol riders to transfer messages quickly and effectively. The first messenger would travel by horseback to the nearest yam, where another messenger already stationed there would take over and travel to the next station, while the original rider recovered from his journey. And so on it went.
I'm of great opinion that communication traveled faster in the pre-modern world than we want it to travel. We want everything to travel basically the speed of a horse, or basically the speed of a ship, traveling at normal speeds. In fact, they had messenger services. We know the Mongols had messenger services. We know that those messenger services traveled on many horses over many days for many men to carry one message.
In his life as a messenger and scout, Canubish travels along the Silk Road trade routes, where it was said a maiden with a plate of gold on her head could wander safely from one end to the other. The year is 1241. Canubish is 21 and is a scout and courier. And Ogedei Khan is the supreme leader of the Mongol Horde. Ogedei, the young man who Genghis Khan chose to be his successor, was, in many respects, his father's son. For Ogedei was not content with ruling over his father's newly conquered lands. No, Ogedei Khan sought to expand the empire, who knows how far, to the limits of the known world, perhaps.
Where was the end of the world for the Mongols? They get all the way to Russia. They get all the way to the Hindu Kush. They get all the way to the Iranian Kush. The extent of Asia in their minds has probably been crossed. They do make it all the way into Hungary, but what promotes them into Hungary is unknown.
By Christmas 1241, Ogedei and his generals had expanded the Khanate by conquering what was left of northwest China and pushing into Russia. The year before, they had sacked Kiev in modern-day Ukraine, and the Horde was rapidly moving west. All of Europe trembled in the face of the Mongols, their terrifying reputation, the ruthless Mongol cavalry, and their sophisticated siege tactics. When the huge Mongol army reached Hungary, King Bela IV tried to stop them at the Battle of Mohi, but even the fierce Hungarians were no match for the Mongol hordes.
Their European campaign, the Mongols met with the Hungarian army. This was particularly interesting meeting because Hungarians originally were nomads as Mongols, so they were using originally the same way of warfare. But we are speaking about the 13th century, so the Hungarian army during the 13th century was already a common European army with heavy horsemen, heavy armor, and using a short distance fight technique. On the other hand, the Mongols were using the typical nomadic tactics, so they were using the swift attacks, light cavalry, and they were surprising their enemies. So, in a way, it was meeting with between the European and the nomadic warfare.
In the aftermath of the Battle of Mohi, Ogedei's armies unleashed hell on the Hungarians, killing an estimated 1 million people. Whether noble, knight, or peasant, they were indiscriminately put to the slaughter by the Mongol invaders. It was one of the bloodiest invasions of a blood-soaked period in history. Hungary first, the rest of Europe next. That is how it must have looked. December 1241, as the rest of Christian Europe quaked in its boots. And then, something like a miracle occurred. The great Ogedei Khan, the bloodthirsty son of Genghis Khan, had always been a hard drinker. Then one night in December of 1241, he drank himself to death, aged 65. With the death of Ogedei Khan, the Mongols withdrew from the fringes of Europe. They turned their forces back towards Karakorum, the Mongol capital, for the election of a new leader. Right on the brink of invasion, and they suddenly withdrew. Hungary aside, Europe had been spared the Mongol war machine. But exactly why?
One thing can be certain when you've got nomadic forces, or you have forces that rely on charismatic leadership like the Mongols did, is when that charismatic leader dies, there's a vacuum. And that vacuum is going to be filled by somebody. We know with the Ottomans, for example, that when the Sultan died, the West could breathe easy for a few years while that inheritance was settled.
When a great Khan died, all the princes had to reconvene in a so-called Kurultai. It's like a great council meeting. They had to meet in a Kurultai to decide on the next leader. So it was paramount that all the princes return to the center to make this decision. If they didn't come, they wouldn't partake. Basically, that prevented the possible expansion, the conquest into Europe.
After their withdrawal from Central Europe in 1242, Mongol armies would return from time to time to slaughter, raid, and plunder. But there would be no large-scale invasion, and their withdrawal that year was the beginning of the end of the Mongol Empire. Ogedei Khan's fatal drinking binge had saved Western Europe from the Mongol hordes. But was that necessarily a good thing, or might a generation under Mongol rule have accelerated their development?
So it's quite possible, yes, that Europe would have fallen, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Remember, Iran fell to the Mongols, we had the Ilkhanate, and they, first of all, they became Iran again. They benefited. They had a very, they were able to absorb it. Remember that the Mongols absorb people. Interesting enough, when they conquered Iran, they formed this multicultural, multi-ethnic state, ruling with the Persians.
Who knows? Once the actual invasion was over, the Mongols usually turned out to be fairly benevolent dictators. But it isn't the Mongols' tolerance and enlightenment for which they will be remembered, or their skills as administrators. They'll always be remembered for their Khans, their conquerors, and their ferocious warriors. Theirs was truly the warrior's way. The life of a Mongol warrior wouldn't have much appeal for most of us today. Too violent, but also too arduous and austere. But what lessons can be learned from the brave and resilient Mongol warrior?
What lessons can we learn from the Mongols? Probably don't let them exist again. They were an incredibly ruthless, terrible war-fighting machine that destroyed everybody in its wake. No more Mongols.
Well, that's one viewpoint, but here's another.
I mean, people say, when did it end? The Mongol Empire didn't end. And for example, it came to an end in Iran, but there was no Mongol, didn't go home. They just faded away, and they didn't. Nobody ever went home. In China, the Yuan dynasty came to an end, and yes, the actual Great Khan did return to Mongolia, but he went with his immediate army. But for all the millions of people who made up the Yuan dynasty, they didn't go anywhere. They were there. In other words, it was assimilated. So I think the greatest mistake that people make about the Mongols, they think of them as an entity which spread from the steppe around the world. It didn't. It was a movement. It was a revolution, and it was transforming the whole time.
And it lasts in one shape or form until today. Although we may not know it, we may all have the spirit of the great Khan living on within us. In his crammed 64 or so years, Genghis Khan had several wives and hundreds of concubines to ensure his legacy would last long into the future. Who knows, you may even share some of this great warrior's DNA. Geneticists have estimated that around 16 million people alive today are genetic descendants of Genghis Khan. Was that the warrior's way? Well, it was certainly a way of keeping the Khan's legacy and warlike spirit alive long after he had departed the field of battle.